You can now reevaluate what is actually important to you because grief changes us in this way. Be willing to let go of like what you thought life might have looked like. You get to grieve that and you get to refine your purpose.
Hi, my name is Kelly Wright, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Spotlight, here where we like to highlight people who are helping people in the world turn their pain into purpose. Today we have our guest, Charlene Lamb. Hi, Charlene.
Hi, Kelly. Great to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have this opportunity, and I'm so glad to see how this conversation unfolds.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. I like it. So, I like to get straight down to business. Charlene, you've built such a powerful body of work around your work with grief and storytelling. Can you share what first inspired you to dedicate your life to this mission?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who work with grief and loss, we come to it because of our own losses, right? That we experience a major change or loss in our lives, which for me was losing my mother. Her name was Marilyn, and she died from a stroke very suddenly and unexpectedly in January of 2013. And I think, like a lot of people, intellectually, we know these things will happen. But when they actually happen to us, we realize, oh my gosh, I'm so unequipped for this. How come no one told me it would be like this? What do I do now? And again, like a lot of people who have experienced these losses and emerge on the other side and found that we can not just survive, but also thrive, we decide, you know what? I want to help other people. I want to be the person that I wish I had when I was experiencing that. So my origin story very much starts with my mom. Sometimes I say in my 30s, I lost my mother and I found myself. I found my purpose. I found my work. And I can tell you more about that, the specifics of it, if you have questions about it.
I love that. I love that statement. Losing your mother, yet finding yourself. So
Mm,
beautiful. So beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you.
thanks. I mean, I'd rather have her back, right? I'd rather she be alive. But yeah, I don't want to say silver lining necessarily, right? Like it's not like we want to go into a place of I don't even want to say it, toxic positivity. That's not what it's about. But if there is some kind of post-traumatic growth, if there is some purpose that emerges from it, then it's like something emerging from the ruins, right? The disaster that happened.
Yes, love that. I love that. Yes, thank you, Charlene. So, Charlene, what does, in your opinion, grief storytelling mean to you? And how is it different from traditional grief counseling?
Storytelling, one, I've always loved stories. I always thought I was going to be a journalist. I was the editor of my school newspaper. I wrote a lot of stories, and my mom was very proud of my writing, and she encouraged that a lot. When it comes to storytelling and grief, I often think of it as usually about meaning and narrative. When we talk about meaning making after a major loss, one of the ways that we can think about it is one, our brains are always making meaning just going through our lives, right? We see things, people say things to us, and our brains come up with some kind of meaning. We interpret it. And then after a major loss, it's like your whole world changes. The way you thought the world was going to be, the way you thought your life was going to be. You thought it was going to look a certain way. You'd be doing something in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and maybe assuming that that person was going to be there or that you were always going to be in this job or have this kind of identity. And when a major change or a major loss happens, that totally rocks your world. It's like you have to rebuild your understanding of what does the world look like now? What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of living? And part of that is about meaning reconstruction, rebuilding both the meaning of my life, but also what do other things mean? What did their life mean? So I love this idea of meaning making because, yes, our brains do it kind of as default, but I also see it as a choice that we can choose what stories we want to tell about our people. We can choose what stories we want to tell about ourselves after the loss. And we can choose the narrative of our person's life and even of how they died. And we can choose the narrative of our own lives. So I guess that answers the first one about storytelling. And then I guess the second part about the difference between grief counseling. I can get into that too. But is there anything you wanted to say before that?
No,
We go into that.
I think that was wonderful. I think that was wonderful. But I wanted to ask also, in conjunction to something you said, how do you believe or how do you think that storytelling actually can heal with grief in the grieving process?
You know the phrase like a painful thought? Most people understand what I mean when I say a painful thought, that it's like, oh, it's a thought that's painful when I think it. And I think many of us also have painful stories.
Mm.
Like, yes, there's the essential pain of losing someone we cared about or losing something we cared about, which could be a job, it could be a pet, it could be a place, it can be a plan. There's the essential pain in that loss, and we have painful stories. So, for instance, I often talk about how my mother never opened the last email that I sent her. She sent me an email. I was traveling and I took a day to send her the reply. And looking back, I could see she never opened that last email. And I think it's so common to have regrets, right, as a grieving person. But that was one of my regrets, looking back, kind of beating myself a bit, saying, like, well, why was I neglecting my mother? All right, why did I not reply to her email right away? She could have opened that email on her last day, and we were talking about Paris. And she could have opened that email and seen my suggestion that we meet up in Paris and enjoyed that thought, enjoyed imagining that trip on her last day. But she never opened that email because I didn't send it in time. And the story I had about that was that means I was a bad daughter. I did not love my mom enough. I did not tell her enough how important she was. And that was my story. It was a very painful story. And I think most of us can relate to something like that, where we think it's a helpful interpretation, but actually causes us a lot of pain. It's very painful to think about it. And I think it gets in the way of us healing. To me, that idea of pain and suffering, essential pain and unnecessary suffering. When we lose someone, we have that essential pain of having that connection severed, right? Of having that bond changed in a way that we often didn't choose. And then we add on additional suffering with, I should have done this, I could have done this. Let me add on some guilt. Let me add some regret. Let me add some shame. And I think that unnecessary suffering actually gets in the way of the kind of normal process of healing that comes from that severing of that relationship as we knew it.
When you said shoulda, coulda, woulda, how do
Mm.
you and how would you help someone navigate struggling with dealing with that, feeling like they should have told a loved one something, feeling like they wish they did this or they wish they had said that? How do you help them deal with when they're struggling to process a shoulda, woulda, coulda?
I think it always starts with awareness, right? Just acknowledging that, yes, it's there, right? And to normalize it because it's very, very common for grieving people to experience that should have, would have, could have. It's a very normal part of the grieving process for a variety of reasons. Contemporary grief research says there might be a range of reasons why we do that. So for some of us, it's about control, that if we can believe that there was something that we could have done, then that gives us a sense of control in a situation that often is very lacking in control for a lot of us, right? Maybe there was a medical condition, maybe something happened where there was no way for us to have done anything. But we really, really want to believe that we could have, because feeling powerless like that is a very difficult emotion and a very difficult experience for human beings. Other research says that, oh, we might spin off into that would have, could have, should have, because it's a way to avoid grieving. Like if we get to focus our energy and our brain power and our kind of research even into what could I have done differently? I should have done this differently. It's a way to avoid actually processing the grief and some of the other emotions that might be coming up. So one, normalizing that. And then two, because I'm not a medical professional, right? I'm a grief coach. And when we talk about support for grief, it's important to know that there is a whole spectrum of care for grief. Yes, you can work with a psychiatrist, you can work with a psychologist, you can work with a therapist, you can work with a counselor, and there are non-medical forms of grief support that can include grief coaching, like with someone like me, but it can also include community support groups. It can include church, religion, faith, spiritual practices. It can include journaling, meditation. It can include yoga or dance. There are a whole range of ways that you can support yourself as you're grieving. But because what I do is not about helping someone who really needs the help of a medical professional, I work with people who are experiencing normal grief, but could use some extra support. The way I like to think of it is not so much in terms of what's healthy or not healthy, but more in terms of what is helpful and not helpful. And that gives us a whole range of ways to look at what we're experiencing. So if we have that story about, oh, I should have, is it helpful or not helpful? And that's not necessarily like one or the other. You get to decide, right? If going into that story of I should have gives you a sense of control, and that's what's helpful for you right now, because you're grappling with so much else that's out of your control, okay, then we can see that that's the role that that story is playing for you. But if we look at that story of guilt or regret and we say, actually, it's kind of unhelpful in terms of how I want to be living my life or how I want to be remembering my person. If I held on to all these stories of guilt and regret and shame about my mother, I wouldn't be doing the work that I do. I wouldn't be creating exhibitions about grief and telling people about her in my talks and in my book and throughout my work, right? I wouldn't even likely be helping other people with grief because I would avoid thinking about my mother. I would avoid talking about her. I would avoid processing the grief that I experienced after losing her. So that's an example of how holding on to grief and regret story would be unhelpful. Okay? That's how I like to look at it. What's helpful, unhelpful. And then if we identify like, oh, it's unhelpful, then we can figure out how to like loosen its grip on you a bit.
Nice, nice. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was dynamic, dynamic. So I had another question. I had a
Yeah.
question. So for those who aren't familiar with you and the work you do, could you explain a little bit about that, please, Charlene?
Yeah. So I often say I'm a grief coach, I'm a curator, speaker, and author. But I guess what underpins a lot of my work is the meaningful objects and what remains after loss. And that means working with, sometimes I'm working with people on the actual belongings and sometimes like symbolic objects because people are dealing with the physical stuff because that's what's most challenging and most heavy for them after loss. Other people, we're working more with the emotional stuff because that's also what remains. That's also what might feel most heavy to someone. And taking a step back, all the way back to 2012, no, 2013. Gosh, that's like the marker of like the before and the after, right? 2012, the last year my mom was alive. 2013, the year she died, and everything changed. But going back to that year, 2013, it really did start with my mom's stuff, with her belongings. Um, like a lot of people, I had the task of figuring out what to do with her house, with her estate, and with all of her belongings. And I had what felt like an impossible problem trying to make all these decisions. And I, sometimes I say inspiration and sometimes I say desperation, but I had a creative solution to this problem, which was I asked myself, okay, as a grieving daughter, right, I can't choose. Like everything my mom owned was precious in that house. But what if I pretended I was going to curate an exhibition, like an art exhibition or a museum exhibition about my mother? If I were to curate an exhibition about my mother, which 100 objects would I choose to display? And that question changed my problem, right? I looked at the situation entirely differently. Before, my story about going through my mother's house was this is a terrible situation that I'm very ill equipped to deal with, that I'm in an impossible situation. I'm going to lose my marriage because my husband doesn't understand why I can't just empty out and sell my mother's house. That was part of the story, right, of what I was experiencing. And this is impossible. This is terrible. This is all a tragedy. When I asked myself that curating question, suddenly it shifted the way I saw my situation to, oh, one, I actually do have these curating and creative skills because I was working as an independent curator in London when my mother died. So curating was already something that I did regularly. Oh, I already have some skills that I can call on. Oh, I can make this process a creative process. I can make this difficult situation into a potentially meaningful, beautiful, like terribly painful, but still beautiful process of choosing and sorting through what was important to my mom and what's important to me now. So it just shifted everything for me. And that was really the start of it. I was my first client. I helped myself see it differently, right? And then that formed the basis for everything that I do now.
Nice. Nice. So walk us through what it's like to work with you and how that process unfolds.
Yeah. People come to me in different situations, right? Some people, because they've heard the story of how I had to deal with my mother's house, they come to me because they have physical stuff. They need to sell a house, or they have a storage unit that they've been paying thousands of dollars for that they need to empty the storage unit. Or there are boxes in the attic or in the basement where it feels like, you know what, it's time. We need to move. Or, you know what, I just want to have that space back. So they'll come to me because they're dealing with the physical stuff, but like the typical home organizing tips are not enough. Because along with that piles of stuff, there's like piles of grief. You open a box and suddenly it's like, oh my God, there's memories, there's stories, there's guilt, there's regret, right? There are questions. So we work through that. I have a course, a group course called Sorting the Stuff of Life and Loss. And that is in partnership with What's Your Grief, which is a very well-respected grief platform that was co-founded by two grief therapists. And I find that when people are in community and they get to hear, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one who cried over a jar of pickles. I'm not the only one who hasn't touched their clothes after 2 years. That's a really great place to start, from that place of compassion, self-compassion, and recognizing I'm not alone in this. I'm not crazy. Grief can make us feel crazy, but I am not crazy. This is very normal. And we can make choices. I think I forgot to name that, like, my overall philosophy for all this is called curating grief. Right? Curating grief, starting with that question. If I were to curate an exhibition about my mother, and I'll also note that you don't need to be a curator. Like, you don't need to be a professional curator to do this. You don't need to be artistic. You do not need to, you can consider yourself creative. That everyone can curate. Like, we are always choosing, and we are choosing with intention every day. And to me, that's how I define curating. It's just choosing with intention, right? What takes up space in your home, what takes up space in your heart and in your head. And when we have physical stuff that we're finding difficult to sort through, difficult to make choices about, often that physical stuff reflects something about our internal world. It reflects something about our relationship with grief or other emotions that's kind of manifesting in that difficulty going through the physical things. So that's one scenario where they might work with me in a course like that, or some people are not group people and they prefer to work with me one-to-one. So I work with people in those ways as well. Other people, it's the emotional stuff, right? Maybe you are weighed down by grief, but also weighed down by guilt or by regret. And we still use that idea of meaningful objects. We still use that idea of curating, but it's as if instead of working on your physical space, right, your home, your living space, we're working on your internal space. It's like curating an imaginary exhibition about your person, looking at, oh, if your relationship with your person was a museum, how many of those gallery spaces would be taken up by your guilt? How much of that space would be taken up by how you actually want to remember them? Right. So I'm still using that metaphor of a gallery. I'm still using that analogy of like curating an exhibition in that grief coaching work. It helps to kind of anchor the conversation. It helps to anchor what we talk about, because when we talk about loss, there's so much we can go into. And then I also have this method called the 10 object method, because you'll remember my original question was 100 objects and about my mother. And for some people, 100 sounds like not enough. They're like, I have thousands that I could choose. And for others, the idea of curating 100 objects might seem like really difficult and daunting. So I use this 10 object method to say, like, okay, let's start with a mini exhibition. Which 10 objects would you choose? What are the stories attached to that? Why are those 10 important to you? And that's a great starting point for going to coaching, for exploring like what their kind of grief landscape looks like. And I do that both in one-to-one, in group, and also like in just in the talks and workshops that I give. I hope that all makes sense.
Yes, yes, yes. And for your one-to-one coaching and your group coaching, how could someone get in contact with you to get signed up with that?
You can go to curatinggrief.com, and that's where you go and you can decide, oh, do I want inspiration? Do I want to see some of the exhibitions that she's done? My creative platform is called The Grief Gallery, and that's the name that I use for the exhibitions that I do about grief and loss. So you can go to curatinggrief.com and you can point off to that, the exhibitions that I've done. And then if you actually want help, support with grief, then curatinggrief.com also has links to signing up for my free monthly grief gathering, which happens on the last Wednesday of every month on Zoom. Or you can download a sample chapter of my book that's also called Curating Grief. And you can find out more about my one-to-one and other ways to work with me. So, yeah, I welcome you to do that.
Yes, yes. Okay. And what do you say to someone who feels like they've lost their sense of purpose after a great loss and they're having a hard time dealing with their grief?
I guess it depends a little bit on their relationship with grief, how close they are to the loss itself. Was there a specific timeline that you were thinking of, or like a recent loss, or like a couple of years out?
Just, I guess in general, someone that's lost someone, let's say a couple years out, and they're still struggling to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, grieving is a lifelong process, right? That if you're having a hard time, you can decide for yourself what it means to be having a hard time. Meaning, yes, I do feel sad on my mother's birthday every year, 12 years later. Is that okay? Of course it's okay. Yes, I go on vacation and wish that I could bring my mother because she loved views of the ocean. Is that okay? Yes, of course that's okay. If a couple of years out, I can't get out of bed because I feel so crushed by the grief or the guilt, then that's a really great indicator that, like, okay, I'm not functioning in the way that I should be and could be. And that's a good indicator that you want to work with a medical professional, seek out a therapist. But to that question about purpose, I often think that in terms of like a disaster, when we experience these major losses, and there's so many metaphors for grief, but if we take one of them as an example of like being lost in an ocean of grief, immediately after a loss, and when we say early loss, like we mean like a year, 2 years. That's still a very, very recent loss. That you can feel like I am drowning in an ocean of grief. I am, I've lost my direction, right? My boat has capsized. I'm just trying to keep my head above water. If you're feeling like that, of course you feel like you don't have purpose, right? You're still in survival mode. you're still trying to just get oriented of where you are. Of course, like your navigation that you had before, the trek you were on before, has changed now. So I wouldn't worry about feeling like you've lost purpose. It's so normal, right? You're just in survival mode. That's your purpose, to just get through the day to day. And then as you feel like, oh, the waves of grief are not so huge, or I've gotten better at kind of riding them out, or I'm rebuilding my boat, or now I'm a stronger swimmer, then you might feel like, oh, okay, my purpose, the direction I was going in, might not look exactly the way it did before. Of course, it doesn't. My life has changed, the circumstances have changed, I've changed. But now you can kind of look at, okay, what is my North Star now? What is my harbor that I'm going toward? You can now reevaluate what is actually important to you, because grief changes us in this way. Be willing to let go of like what you thought life might have looked like. You get to grieve that and you get to refine your purpose.
So, Charlene, could you tell us, how do you help people transform guilt, anger, or regret into something meaningful and when they're working with you?
Yeah, can you give me an example? Like what prompts this question?
I guess with your curating, let's say with that, how do you help them transform with the curating process into something meaningful to them?
So, curating grief, there are, well, seven C's. I love the letter C. My first name starts with C, my middle initial is C. We start always with compassion, including a lot of self-compassion, curiosity, and then clarity. It's like we get to start with those because then we get into action. When I tell people about curating grief, they like to jump straight to how do I curate? And it's like, well, curating is an action. Before we dive into the action, we want to have compassion, curiosity, and clarity. And then we get into the three like action C's, which are collect, curate, and create. And then the last C is choose again, just FYI, because it's a cycle. We keep on choosing, right? We keep on experiencing grief in different ways. Like, of course, it evolves as we evolve and it changes with time, but we get to choose again. But if we go, we kind of zoom in to the three middle C's, collect, curate, and create, there are like anchoring questions underneath it. So collect is, how do you remember your person, or how do you remember the thing that was lost? It's permission to look at everything that comes up for you, right? The good stuff, the bad stuff, the good memories, the painful stories. So that's the first one, collect. And then curate is where we actually start to choose. We ask ourselves, how do I want to remember my person? How do I want to remember what I lost? And then we can look at what we looked at and collect and said, oh, okay, well, of these different memories, what is it that I want to spotlight? What is it that, if it was a snapshot, that's the photo I want to frame. I don't necessarily want to frame the photo of how they looked in the hospital. What I want to frame is the photo of the family gatherings on the weekend at their home. That's an example of like choosing something to frame. In that instance, that's like a photo, but of course it represents so much, right? So question one, how do I want to remember? Question two, how do I want to remember? And then the last one, create. How do I want them to be remembered? This implies that there is a little public showing, that there's a little audience, and you don't have to make your curations public. I've had clients curate mini exhibitions about their person where the audience was just themselves, right? How do I want to remember my person? But for someone else, it might be, and how do I want them to be remembered? Because someone else might be saying, my children will never know their grandparent. What do I want them to know about their grandparent? What can I create that helps to capture a story, capture a facet about them that I can then show to my children so they understand a bit more about who their grandparent was? And for some people, that looks like a book, right? They've curated stories, they've chosen illustrations. and turn it into a book. Their book is their exhibition. Other people make a film. So it doesn't have to be a gallery exhibition, even though that's the kind of like structure that I like to imagine and I like to work with. But does that help of like explaining a bit of that process?
Yes, 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 it does. And I wanted to ask, what's one message of hope you'd share with someone listening right now who's in the middle of their darkest times dealing with grief?
That your relationship to grief can change. And right now, it might feel like grief is trying to drown you, that grief is beating you down. Some of my clients say grief feels like opening Pandora's box. Something scary might come out, something I don't want to face might come out. I'm afraid to open that box. But over time, your relationship with it can change. That maybe right now it feels like a scary, burdensome monster in your life, or it feels like a weight that's dragging you down. But time does not heal all wounds. That's not true. But time is a factor when it comes to grief. Your grief will evolve, and I believe your relationship to grief will evolve. Where at first, grief was something I wanted to avoid, and then grief became a teacher. I did not necessarily enjoy the lessons, but I learned from grief. And now, more than 10 years after my mom died, I would say, oh, grief is a creative collaborator for me. I don't know that I would call it a friend, but we do a little dance together. You know, the work that I do with my exhibitions, the work that I do in my book, the work that I do with my writing and my speaking, the work that I do with my clients, grief had a part in that. Grief co created this with me. Grief is my creative collaborator. And that's my hope for everyone who's really hurting and really feeling that weight of it, that it can feel lighter, that it will feel lighter, and that your relationship with it will change.
Nice, nice. And how can listeners stay connected with you, join your workshops or join your coaching or experience doing a curated project with you?
You can go to curatinggrief.com. That has all my links. You can watch my TEDx talk if you want to kind of see a little more of my approach to grief support. You can connect with me on Instagram. I'm at curating_grief. And you are welcome to experience what it's like. During the monthly grief gathering, I invite people to share a meaningful object or to share the story of a meaningful object. And you get to experience for yourself what it's like to choose something, to curate something, and to invite people to witness the meaning of it, to witness the significance of it, to witness you sharing about the person or the thing that you lost. And then when you work with me in a group or you work with me one to one, we get to go deeper into that process of what does it mean to choose? What does it mean to curate? What might be in the way of you choosing or curating, or in the way of you creating in the way that you want? And we get to use the objects, we get to use the belongings, we get to use the stories as a way to access and explore all of that to really transform your experience of grief.
Well, there you have it, guys. Charlene Lamb. She's here ready and available to help you transform you and help you to turn your pain into purpose. Thank you guys for another episode. This is Behind the Spotlight.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.